She came to him half dead in a blizzard. He offered her a ring, not love. What happened next, neither of them could have predicted. A woman stripped of everything, her job, her home, her dignity, collapses in the snow outside a stranger's gate. A man hollowed out by grief raises two boys alone in a house that hasn't felt like a home in years. One desperate night, one impossible offer, and a marriage built on nothing but survival. But survival has a strange way of becoming something else entirely. Something neither of them asked for. Something neither of them can stop. If this story finds you wherever you are, drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button and stay with us until the very end. The last thing Evelyn Hartwell expected to feel on the night she nearly died was relief. She had been walking for 6 hours, maybe 7. The kind of walking that stops being about getting somewhere and turns into something more primitive. Just movement, just one foot ahead of the other, because stopping meant lying down. And lying down in this cold meant not getting up again. The Montana sky had gone from gray to white to the particular shade of nothing that only comes when a blizzard decides it is finished, warning you and begins in earnest. She was 31 years old. She had 22 cents in her coat pocket. The coat itself was a thin wool thing, better suited for a schoolroom than a mountain winter, and it had stopped doing its job somewhere around the 3rd hour. Her fingers had gone numb after 4. By hour 6, she had stopped being able to feel her feet, which she understood was not a good sign, but she had run out of options for interpreting signs of any kind. 3 weeks ago, she had been a school teacher in the town of Mill Haven, Montana. Now she was dying in the snow outside a fence she could barely see. The fence materialized out of the white like something from a fever dream. Thick cedar posts solid and dark against the swirling pale. She grabbed the nearest post with both hands and held on, not because she meant to, but because her legs had simply stopped cooperating. She slid down the post until she was kneeling in the snow, her face level with the lowest crossbar, and she pressed her forehead against the cold wood and breathed. "Get up," she told herself. "Get up right now." Her body did not respond. She could see a light in the distance, faint, amber, wavering through the curtain of snow, but real. A building. A lamp in a window. Maybe a quarter-mile away. Maybe more. It was impossible to judge distance in this. But a light meant people, and people meant warmth, and warmth was the only thing left in the world that she wanted. "Get up," she said again, out loud this time. Her voice came out cracked and strange, scraped hollow by the cold. She got up. She could not have said afterward how she covered that quarter-mile. She had no memory of it that made any coherent sense. There were impressions. The wind taking her sideways twice, something that might have been a barn materializing on her left, the crunch of her boots through ice-crusted snow that she couldn't feel breaking underfoot. And then there was a door, and the door had a small iron knocker shaped like a horseshoe, and she raised her fist and knocked 3 times before she realized she couldn't feel her hand doing it. Then she sat down in the snow in front of the door, because the sitting was simply what happened next, and she looked up at the dark sky and the falling white, and she thought, with the strange clarity that comes at the edge of things, I should not have trusted that man. She meant Harold Baines, former member of the Mill Haven School Board, a man with a wide smile and small eyes who had told her 6 weeks ago that her position was secure. She had trusted him anyway. That was the last thought she managed before the door opened. Nathan Crow was not a man who answered his door after dark without a rifle in his hand. This was not paranoia. This was geography. His ranch, the Crow Spread, 1,200 acres running up against the eastern foothills of the Beartooth Range, sat 18 miles from the nearest town of any size, and the kind of men who knocked on ranch doors in blizzards were not always the kind of men you wanted inside. He had learned this at 24 the hard way, when a pair of drifters had knocked on his father's door in similar weather, and his father, being a more charitable man than Nathan, had let them in. His father had recovered, eventually, but Nathan had not forgotten. So when the knock came, 3 sharp raps, uneven, desperate, he took the rifle down from the wall rack and checked that it was loaded before he moved toward the door. Behind him, from the back of the house, he could hear Ben's voice, his younger son, asking something. He called back, "Stay put," and meant it. He opened the door. The woman on his porch step was not a threat. She was a catastrophe. She was sitting in the snow, actually sitting in it, her thin coat dark with wet, her dark hair plastered to the side of her face, and she was looking up at him with eyes that were slightly unfocused, the way eyes get when the body is devoting its resources entirely to keeping itself alive and has nothing left over for social graces. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her hands, pressed flat against the porch boards on either side of her, were not quite shaking because shaking required muscle engagement she no longer had. "I need—" she started. She did not finish the sentence. Nathan Crow had not thought of himself as a man who moved quickly anymore. He was 38 years old. He had a bad knee from a horse accident 2 winters back. He had been tired in some deep, settled way since the day Clara died. And tired men do not move quickly. He was through the door and catching her before she hit the boards. The rifle somehow propped against the door frame in the same motion, and she was lighter than she should have been, significantly lighter than a grown woman had any right to be, and cold, even through his flannel shirt, cold in a way that meant she had been outside for a long time. "Hey," he said. "Hey, look at me." Her eyes found his. They were brown, he noticed. Dark brown, nearly black, and even in this state they had something sharp in them, something that was not quite gone. "I'm not—" She tried again. "You don't have to be anything right now," he said. "Just stay awake." He carried her inside. The house was warm in the way that ranch houses in Montana get warm in winter. Not the delicate warmth of a parlor, but the deep, serious warmth of a place that has been fighting the cold for months and has gotten good at it. 2 fires going, one in the kitchen range and one in the front room hearth, and the smell of wood smoke and something cooking, something with onions and meat that hit Evelyn's half-conscious nose like a physical blow. She was aware of being set down on something soft. A couch, she thought. She was aware of a voice, a man's voice, low and direct, saying things she couldn't quite catch, and then 2 other voices, higher, younger, and the man's voice again saying, "Go get the spare blankets. The wool ones, not the thin ones, now." The sound of feet on a wooden floor, running. Then warmth began to happen to her, slow and deliberate, starting at her feet, and she understood distantly that someone was pulling off her boots. She should have cared about this. She had been raised to care about propriety, about the correct sequence of actions between strangers, about what it meant for a man to remove a woman's boots. She found, at this particular moment, that she did not care at all. "Your feet are bad," the man's voice said, from somewhere near the floor. "Can you feel them?" "No," she said. "Can you feel this?" A hand gripped her left ankle firmly. "No." "Okay." A pause. "What about this?" Different pressure. Higher. A little. "Good." A short exhale that was not quite relief. "That's better than nothing." She turned her head and looked at him properly for the first time. He was big. Not tall exactly, but built the way men who work with their hands get built. Broad through the shoulders and thick in the arms, with the kind of face that starts out angular and gets worn down by weather into something harder and more specific. Dark hair going gray at the temples, a jaw that needed shaving, eyes that were light-colored in the firelight, gray or maybe pale green, and they were looking at her with the focused, assessing attention of someone trying to determine the exact size and nature of a problem. He did not look like a man who smiled much. He also did not look like a man who meant her harm, which at this particular juncture was the more relevant quality. "Nathan Crow," he said. It was not quite an introduction. It was more like information being transferred. "Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "Millhaven?" She blinked. "You know it?" "Know of it. 18 miles south." He sat back on his heels and looked at her steadily. "You walked from Millhaven." "I walked from the Miller Road junction. I had a ride to there." She paused. The sentence had cost her something. "The man said he was going farther north. He wasn't." Nathan's expression did not change precisely, but something in it tightened. "Left you at the junction in this weather." "He left me at the junction in this weather," she confirmed. A silence. Then he stood up and called toward the back of the house. "Lucas, bring the soup." "Awesome." The 2 boys appeared together in the kitchen doorway, which seemed to be how they operated. As a unit, the older one slightly in front, The younger one slightly behind and slightly to the left, close enough to each other that they looked like one creature with two heads. The older one was maybe 9 or 10, with his father's dark hair and a face set in the careful, neutral expression of a child who has learned to be cautious about new things. The younger one was 6 or 7, rounder, with lighter hair and eyes that were openly, unguardedly curious. The older one, Lucas, she would learn, was carrying a bowl of soup with the extreme careful attention of someone who has been trusted with something important and intends to prove the trust was not misplaced. The younger one, Ben, was carrying a folded wool blanket pressed against his chest. "She's not dead," Ben announced. He said it with the particular satisfaction of a child whose hypothesis has been confirmed. "Ben," his father's voice was a single syllable of warning. "I just said she's not dead." "That's good." "It's quite good," Evelyn said, and was surprised to find that her voice was steadier. "I wasn't confident about that myself for a while." Ben's face opened into a grin that was extravagant and unself-conscious and somehow painful to look at. It was so unguarded. "I'm Ben," he said. "That's Lucas. He thinks you're trouble." "Ben," Lucas said, in an exact reproduction of his father's tone. He didn't say it, but he was thinking it. I could tell because he made the face. "I'm not trouble," Evelyn said. "Or I'm trying not to be." She looked at the older boy, Lucas, who was holding the soup bowl and watching her with those careful eyes. "Thank you for the soup." Lucas set the bowl on the low table beside the couch without speaking. Then he looked at his father in a way that communicated a great deal more than words, turned, and walked back toward the kitchen. Ben unfolded the blanket and draped it over Evelyn's legs with concentrated effort. "Lucas makes the face when he's worried," Ben explained confidentially. "He made it a lot after Mama died. He doesn't do it as much anymore." He patted the blanket once, apparently satisfied with his work. "Are you going to stay?" "Ben," Nathan said again, "go help your brother with the dishes." "But I want to, dishes." Ben went, looking over his shoulder twice. Nathan pulled a wooden chair close and sat down. He was still doing the assessing thing, that steady look that was trying to calculate something. Evelyn picked up the soup bowl. Her hands were starting to work properly again, which was a sensation she found unexpectedly moving, just the simple fact of her fingers bending. And she drank some of it, and it was the best thing she had ever tasted in her life, which said something about the state she was in. "What happened to you?" Nathan said. Not unkindly, just directly. She looked at him over the rim of the bowl. "That's a long story for tonight," she said. "I've got nowhere to be." She set the bowl down and folded her hands in her lap and looked at the fire for a moment. Outside, the blizzard was doing what blizzards do. The windows shook gently in their frames. "I was a teacher," she said, "in Millhaven, grades 1 through 6, in the schoolhouse on Clement Street. I had the position for 4 years. She paused. It was good work. Children are honest. They either understand something or they don't, and they'll tell you which. And there's something I've always found clarifying about that." She stopped herself. "I'm getting off track." "Take your time." She looked at him. He meant it. That was interesting. "There's a man in Millhaven named Harold Baines," she said. "He's on the school board. He owns a good portion of the commercial property in town, and he's related by blood or marriage to most of the families with money." She paused. 6 weeks ago, he came to the schoolhouse after the children had gone home for the day. He told me that the board had been very pleased with my work, that my position was secure, and then he told me that he'd been hearing things that concerned him. She stopped. "What kind of things?" Her jaw tightened. "The kind of things a man like that says when he wants something from you and you've made clear you're not interested in providing it." Nathan said nothing. His expression was very still in a way that was different from blankness. "I told him I didn't know what he was talking about," Evelyn continued. "He suggested that I think about it more carefully. I told him there was nothing to think about." She smoothed a non-existent wrinkle in the blanket. 2 weeks later, the board voted to eliminate my position. Budget concerns, they said. The same week, my landlady, who happens to be Harold Baines's cousin, told me my rent had doubled effective immediately, and she'd need payment in full by end of week. A short, humorless breath. I had savings. Some. Not enough for double rent and a new start in a new place at the same time. I wrote to my sister in Billings. She's married to a man who doesn't... A pause. She couldn't help. I tried to find other work in Millhaven, but Baines's name is on half the doors in town. She picked the soup bowl back up. Her hands were completely steady now, which she found she was glad for. So I left. I had enough money for a coach ticket to Harlan, which is the next town north, with a school. I thought I might find a position there. The coach dropped me at the Miller Road junction, where apparently the Miller Road is the only road the coach will take north of November, and then the gentleman who offered me a further ride turned out to be going to his brother's farm, which was 2 miles down a side road. She took a long drink of soup, and then I walked. Nathan was quiet for a moment. "How long since you've eaten?" he said. It was not the question she had been expecting. She thought about it. "Yesterday morning. I had bread and some dried fruit." He stood up. "I'll get more soup." "Mr. Crow? Nathan?" "Nathan." The name felt strange in her mouth, too familiar for someone she'd known for 20 minutes. I'm grateful. More than I can say, but I need to know, when the storm breaks, whether there's somewhere I might... We'll figure that out, he said, when the storm breaks. He went to the kitchen. Evelyn sat with the fire and the wool blanket and the settling of the house around her, and she listened to the muffled sound of 3 voices in the kitchen, 2 high, 1 low, and something that might have been an argument about the correct way to wash a pot. And she felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, that she was in a room where no one was trying to take anything from her. She did not cry. She had cried earlier on the road, twice, and each time the tears had frozen on her face before they'd finished falling, and she had decided that was the universe making a practical point about the timing of grief. She was done crying in the cold. She would cry later when she had somewhere to do it properly. She drank her soup. Nathan did not sleep much that night. He rarely did anymore. This was one of the permanent changes that Clara's death had made in him, the way the dark hours had become something to endure rather than rest in. But that night he sat in the kitchen long after the boys were in bed, and the fire had settled to coals, and he drank black coffee that had gone lukewarm, and thought about the woman asleep on his couch. He thought about Harold Baines, whose name he knew, because Millhaven was the nearest town of size and names traveled. A man with a reaching kind of reputation, the kind that starts with commerce and doesn't stay there. He thought about the way the woman, Evelyn, had told her story. Without performance. Without the particular brand of self-pity that people sometimes use when they want something from you, the unconscious calculation that makes a story a bargaining chip. She had told it the way you tell a thing that happened, flatly, with the occasional rough edge where the flatness didn't quite hold. He thought about his sons. Lucas had made the face. Ben had draped the blanket. Nathan picked up his coffee cup, looked at the cold 1/4 inch of liquid at the bottom, and set it back down. He had a problem. He had been trying to solve this problem for a 1.5 years, and he had not solved it, and a woman with a teaching background and nowhere to go had just walked through his door in a blizzard. He was not a man who believed in signs. He was a man who recognized when a situation had practical dimensions worth examining. He went to bed before midnight and lay there listening to the wind until almost 3. The blizzard blew itself out by morning. Evelyn woke to gray light through frost-edged windows and the smell of coffee and a fire that had been tended while she slept. She sat up on the couch and found that a glass of water had been placed on the table beside her along with her boots, dried and standing upright. Someone had cleaned them. She sat for a moment taking inventory of herself. Her feet had regained full sensation, which came with an aching soreness she took as acceptable. Her hands worked. Her head was clear. The previous night had not killed her, which was more than she had been sure of at several points. She found the kitchen empty but warm, with coffee on the stove and a note. No, not a note, just a loaf of bread set out with a clean knife. A man who had gotten up early and left food for someone he hadn't decided what to do with yet. She cut a piece of bread and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the world. The ranch was larger than she'd understood in the dark. A wide main yard, knee-deep in new snow with a substantial barn to the left and 2 smaller outbuildings beyond it, fencing in all directions, disappearing into timber on the north and east sides, and the mountains, massive and bone-white and indifferent, filling the entire northern sky. She could see Nathan and the older boy, Lucas, working near the barn, shoveling the night's accumulation, clearing a path. The boy worked with a short-handled spade and kept pace with his father without complaint. And the sight of it, the two of them in the thin winter morning, just working, just doing what had to be done, put a cramp in Evelyn's chest she hadn't expected. She heard a sound behind her and turned. Ben was standing in the kitchen doorway, in clothes he had clearly pulled on in a hurry, and boots that were on the wrong feet. He was holding a small, battered book pressed flat against his chest. "You're awake," he said. "I am." "I thought you might leave before I woke up." She looked at him, 6 years old maybe, the kind of round, open face that takes a while to learn to guard itself. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately name. "I'm not going anywhere right now," she said. "The snow's too deep." He seemed to relax slightly. He came into the kitchen and climbed onto one of the chairs at the table and set the book in front of him. "Do you really teach children?" "I did, for 4 years." "What did you teach them?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic, history." She sat down across from him. "Geography, some science, when we had the materials for it." He looked at the book. Then he looked at her. "I can read some," he said, "but there's a lot of words in here I don't know. And Papa says I should sound them out, but some of them I sound out wrong, and I don't know they're wrong until Lucas laughs at me." He paused. "Lucas doesn't mean to be mean. He just knows the right way to say things, and it comes out when I get it wrong." Evelyn looked at the book. She reached across and turned it so she could see the cover. Robinson Crusoe. She looked back at Ben. "That's a hard book," she said. "I know. That's why I keep getting stuck." He pushed it toward her. "Could you maybe show me some of the hard words?" She looked at the boy. Then she looked at the book. Then she pulled it toward her and opened it. "Start from the beginning," she said. "Read me what you can." His face did something enormous and involuntary, the way children's faces do when something they wanted very much simply shows up. He scooted forward in his chair and began. Nathan came in from the barn 2 hours later and found the kitchen transformed. He had expected to find it empty, or to find the woman, Evelyn, sitting alone with her coffee and her careful face. He had been thinking, out in the cold, about what he was going to say to her, about the practical matter of what happened next, about the shape of an offer he hadn't made yet and wasn't sure he should. Instead, he found Ben at the table with Robinson Crusoe open between them, and Evelyn Hartwell bent over the page pointing at a word, and Ben saying, "Providence," with his tongue out slightly in concentration, and Evelyn saying, "Good, now say it faster," and Ben saying, "Providence," with sudden triumph, and Evelyn saying, "That's it, Providence. Now do you know what it means?" Lucas was sitting in the corner by the stove with a piece of harness leather he was supposed to be mending, and he was not mending it. He was watching the two of them at the table with an expression on his face that Nathan had not seen in a year and a half. It was the expression of a child who is permitting himself cautiously to hope for something. Nathan stood in the doorway for a moment longer than he needed to. Then he came in and pulled off his coat and hung it on the hook, and he poured himself a cup of coffee, and he said, "Ben, go help your brother with that harness." Ben opened his mouth. "Now," Nathan said. Ben went, dragging his feet with operatic reluctance, but he went. Lucas followed, the harness leather tucked under his arm, and the kitchen was quiet except for the fire. Nathan sat down across from Evelyn. He set his coffee down. He looked at it for a moment. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. She folded her hands on the table. "All right." He looked up, those dark eyes steady with that particular quality he'd noticed last night, the sharp thing that had not gone out even when she was most desperate. She was waiting without fidgeting, without filling the silence, which was not a thing most people could do. "I've got a problem," he said. "I've had it for a while." "Tell me about it." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. He had thought, out in the cold, that he would approach this strategically. Lay it out in a businesslike way, give her the facts, make the offer, and see what she said. He had thought he would be measured about it. "My wife died," he said. 18 months ago, fever. It came on fast, and by the time I understood how bad it was..." He stopped, lifted the cup, set it down. Clara. Her name was Clara. It still felt strange to use the past tense, and he had been doing it for a year and a half. He didn't think that was going to change. She was the one who kept this house running the way it's supposed to run. Not just cooking and cleaning. She was the one who taught the boys. She was the one who knew what a child needs that isn't food and firewood. He looked out the window. I'm good with the land. I'm good with animals. I can work from before light to after dark and not feel it. But I'm not good at the other part. The part that makes a house a home instead of just a building where people sleep. Evelyn said nothing, but she was listening in a particular way that he could feel. Lucas used to laugh, Nathan said. All the time before. He's 10 now, and He stopped again. Ben asks for her. Still. At night sometimes. He wrapped both hands around the cup. I've got no family in reach. Clara's mother died 2 years before she did. I've looked at hiring someone to help, but the kind of arrangement that makes sense out here, a woman living on the property, looking after the boys, it's not a simple hire. People talk. And more than that, it's not fair to bring someone in without being honest about what the arrangement is and what it isn't. He looked at her directly. You're a teacher. You've been left without a position and without a home, in winter, by someone who didn't deal fairly with you. I've got a home, and I've got 2 boys who need teaching and looking after. I'm proposing a marriage. The word landed in the kitchen with a particular weight. Evelyn did not react, or rather she reacted in a way that was entirely internal. Nathan could see something moving behind her eyes, something calculating and frightened and fierce all at once, but her face and her hands stayed very still. A marriage, she said, a practical one. He kept his voice level. I'm not asking you to pretend to be something you're not. I'm not asking for... He chose the next word carefully. Companionship. Beyond what's appropriate to a working arrangement. You'd have your own room. You'd have security, stability, the legal protection of the name. The boys would have a teacher and someone who is present in the way that children need. In exchange, you'd have a home and a position that nobody can take from you. A pause. I know this is not what people mean when they talk about marriage. No, she said, it's not. I know I'm asking you to decide something enormous in very short order, under circumstances that aren't fair to you. You're asking me, she said slowly, to marry a man I've known for 12 hours. I am. She looked at him. He held the look. Outside, the wind had dropped to nothing, and the world was very quiet. Why? She said. Why not hire a housekeeper? Why not? There are ways to arrange care for children that don't require a legal contract. Because Harold Baines isn't the only man in Montana who notices a woman living alone on a ranch, he said. And I've seen what happens to women in those arrangements when the man dies, or sells the property, or changes his mind. They have nothing. They're not protected. He set the cup down. I'm not a man who offers protection and then removes it. But a hired woman is not a wife, and the law will not treat her like one. If something happened to me, you'd be back where you started. A pause. You did nothing to deserve where you started. The look on her face shifted. Something in it cracked open slightly, just for a moment, before she brought it back. You don't know me, she said. I know you walked 18 miles in a blizzard, rather than stay somewhere you weren't safe. He picked up his cup again. I know you sat down this morning and started teaching my son how to read without being asked, without being paid, without needing to be reminded that it was the decent thing to do. He drank his coffee. I'm a decent judge of character. It's kept me alive in rough country. She looked at the window, at the snow and the flat winter sky above it, and the mountains that went nowhere and gave nothing. I need to think, she said. That's fair. I need more than 20 minutes. I'm not going anywhere, he said, and neither are you. Snow's too deep to travel today. He stood up. Think as long as you need. He took his cup and went to check on his sons. She thought for 4 hours. She sat by the front room window and watched the ranch, and she thought about Harold Baines and what his hand on the doorframe of her classroom had meant, and about the way she'd felt walking away from Mill Haven, which was a kind of shame that was not her shame but had attached to her anyway. The way shame does when it's been thrown at you long enough. She thought about the sister in Billings who had not been able to help and what that had meant and what it would mean to ask again. She thought about what she was, practically, in the world. A woman without a position, without family in reach, without money to make a new start in a place that didn't know Harold Baines's name. She thought about what winter in Montana looked like for a woman in that situation, and she did not let herself flinch away from the image. Then she watched Lucas come into the yard alone and stand looking at the mountains for a long moment, his hand shoved in his coat pockets, his face doing the thing she'd been told it did when he was worried. He was 10 years old. He had the face of someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long. She thought about the look Nathan had on his face when he said Lucas used to laugh. All the time before. She found Nathan in the barn. He was doing something methodical with a length of fence wire, hands moving without looking, the kind of work that takes no concentration and leaves the mind free. He looked up when she came in. "All right," she said. He looked at her steadily. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." She squared her shoulders. "I'll have my own room. I'll have full authority over the boys' education, their lessons, their schedule, what they study and how. You can disagree with my methods, but you don't override them without discussion and reason." She paused. "I'll do my share of the household work, but this is not an arrangement where I am a servant. We are equal parties in a practical agreement, and we will conduct ourselves accordingly." He nodded once. "If either of us—" She stopped. Started again. "If either of us finds the arrangement is not working, we will say so honestly, like adults, and figure out what to do. No silence? No pretending?" She looked at him. "I've had enough of men who pretend." "Agreed," he said. "And I want—" She hesitated on this one. "I want to be honest with the boys. Not about all of it, not the details of why or the arrangement's nature, but I don't want to lie to them about who I am and what I am to them. I won't pretend to be something I'm not with children. They always know anyway. They're better at knowing than adults are." Nathan was quiet for a moment, then, "Agreed." She held out her hand. He looked at it, then he reached out and shook it. A firm grip, a rancher's grip, the kind of handshake that means something in this country. "Evelyn Hartwell," he said. "Nathan Crow," she said. The barn was very still around them. One of the horses moved in its stall. Outside, the sun had broken through and the snow was starting to throw light in every direction, sharp and cold and almost beautiful. Neither of them smiled. There was nothing to smile about yet, and both of them knew it, but it was done. They married 11 days later in the Harlan courthouse, with a judge named Aldridge, who was 60 years old and had seen everything and found everything mildly amusing, and 2 ranch hands named Pete and Olson, who served as witnesses and kept their hats in their hands and their opinions to themselves. Ben wore his good shirt and stood very straight throughout the brief proceeding, and afterward told Evelyn in a serious voice that she had done very well. Lucas stood next to his father and looked at the floor during most of it, but at one point he looked up at Evelyn with those careful 10-year-old eyes, and she held the look steadily and did not look away, and after a moment he looked back down. It was not nothing. She understood that. Nathan said, "I do," in a voice that was clear and flat and committed, the way he seemed to say most things. Evelyn said it in a voice that was mostly steady. Mostly. Afterward, they drove back to the ranch in the wagon, the 4 of them, Ben asking whether they were going to celebrate, and Nathan saying in what way did he mean celebrate, and Ben saying, well, usually at weddings there was cake, and Nathan saying where had he heard that, and Ben saying he'd read it in a story, and Lucas quietly informing him that stories were not always accurate, and Ben saying they were accurate about the cake, he was sure of that. Evelyn listened to the 3 of them and did not say anything, and watched the mountains and thought about what she had just done. She had made a bargain with a man she barely knew in a country she barely knew, in the middle of a Montana winter, because there was nothing left, and this was what there was. She did not know if it was the right choice. She knew it was the only choice, and she knew. She had learned this in 4 years of teaching, learned it from watching children decide whether to trust something new, that sometimes the only way you find out if a thing is right is to live inside it long enough to see. She would find out. She watched the mountains and she let the wagon carry her home. The first morning Evelyn woke up as Evelyn Crow, she lay still for a full minute before she moved. The room Nathan had given her was small and plain. A single window facing east, an iron-framed bed with a good mattress, a chest of drawers that had been recently emptied, a hook on the back of the door. Someone had set a candle on the windowsill and a folded towel on the foot of the bed. There were no curtains. The winter light came in early and flat and honest, and it showed her everything the room was, which was not much, and also exactly what it claimed to be, which counted for something. She had slept better than she had any right to. She dressed quickly in the cold. The room was the farthest from the main hearth and took time to warm, and went to the kitchen and built up the fire in the range before anyone else was awake. It was something to do with her hands. She had always been a person who needed something to do with her hands in the early morning before the day had given her its problems. She was standing at the window with her coffee when Nathan came in from outside, stamping snow off his boots, and stopped when he saw her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at the fire she'd built, and at the coffee, and then he got himself a cup without saying anything else. He sat at the table and she stood at the window, and the kitchen held both of them in the particular quiet of two people who are not yet sure of the distance between them. "The boys get up at 6, he said finally. "Lucas will do it himself. Ben needs someone to tell him twice. I'll remember that. Lucas eats whatever you put in front of him. Ben has opinions about eggs." "What kind of opinions?" Nathan looked at his cup. "Strong ones." She almost smiled. "I'll bear that in mind." He drank his coffee and she watched the yard fill up with thin winter light. And after a while he pulled on his coat and went back out, and she started on breakfast. It was not comfortable those first days. She would not have called it comfortable. But it was functional, which was more than she'd expected, and functional was a place you could build something on if you were careful. The trouble was that careful was exhausting. She was careful about where she stood in the kitchen, about how she addressed Nathan in front of the boys, about the specific weight she gave each word when she spoke to him directly, which she tried to keep to practical matters. The boys' lessons, what was needed from the storeroom, whether the well pump was still sticking. She was careful not to overstep and careful not to undershoot, because both would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. She was walking a line she'd drawn herself on a floor she didn't fully know, and she was doing it while also trying to teach two boys with very different minds, learn the rhythms of a ranch she hadn't grown up on, and manage the low-grade hum of anxiety that had moved into the back of her skull sometime around the third day in Millhaven and hadn't left. Nathan, for his part, was careful too. She could see it in him. The deliberate way he made space for her, the way he knocked before entering a room she was in, the way he said her name with a particular slight pause before it, like a man reminding himself to say a word that was still unfamiliar in his mouth. He was doing his level best, she could see that, but he was also, fundamentally, a man who had sealed something off in himself, and that sealing was not going to come undone just because a woman had moved into his house and started making breakfast. She wasn't asking it to. That was not part of the arrangement, but it made the house feel sometimes like two separate weather systems occupying the same space, each one being very polite about not spilling into the other's territory. The boys were the uncomplicated part, or rather, they were complicated in the ways that children are, which was a kind of complication Evelyn understood how to work with. Ben took to her immediately with the wholehearted lack of self-preservation that was apparently just his nature. Within 3 days, he had claimed the chair immediately to her left at the lesson table as his permanent territory and had begun calling her Evelyn instead of Mrs. Crow, which was technically incorrect for the classroom, but which she let go because correcting it felt like drawing a line she didn't need to draw. He was bright in a scattered, explosive way. Ideas came at him from all directions at once, and his job was to catch enough of them to form a thought, which he mostly managed, and when he did, the results were frequently surprising. He had told her on the 4th day with complete confidence that he believed Robinson Crusoe had made a series of poor decisions that a more attentive person would have avoided. When she asked him to elaborate, he had given her a 12-point argument that was mostly wrong but was structured better than most adult arguments she'd heard, and she had told him so. And he had looked at her with an expression of pure satisfaction that she'd been thinking about for days afterward. Lucas was harder, not hostile. She wanted to be precise about this, because he was not hostile, he was cautious. And caution and hostility feel alike from the outside, but come from entirely different places and require entirely different responses. He did his work. He did it thoroughly. He was, genuinely, one of the sharpest 10-year-olds she had ever taught, with a reading level 2 years beyond his age and an almost unnerving instinct for mathematics. He would answer questions put to him directly, and he would engage when the material engaged him. And there were moments, like when they were working through a geography lesson about the river systems of Montana, and he had suddenly sat forward and started asking questions she had to actually think before answering, when she could see exactly who he was underneath the caution. But he did not volunteer, he did not lean. He watched her the way the ranch dog watched strangers, not threatening, but not giving anything until he decided it was safe. She understood. She gave him room. She did not push. About 2 weeks in, she made an error. It was a Tuesday. She had been trying to establish some order to the days, mornings for lessons, afternoons for helping with ranch work when the weather allowed, evenings for reading, and it had been going reasonably well. But that Tuesday, Nathan came in from the pasture at midday with a problem with one of the fence lines, and he needed Lucas to help him in the afternoon, which meant she had only Ben for lessons. And Ben without Lucas to occasionally anchor him was a very different educational proposition. By 3 in the afternoon, Ben had asked her 11 questions that had nothing to do with the arithmetic they were supposed to be doing, told her a long story about something that had happened to a calf in September, knocked his pencil off the table 4 separate times, and was currently staring out the window at a crow sitting on the fence post with an expression of profound philosophical interest. "Ben," she said. "There were 2 of them before," he said, not looking away from the window. "Where did the other one go?" "I don't know. Ben, we have 3 more problems." "Do crows go home at night, like to a specific place, or just any tree?" "They typically return to roost sites, yes. Ben, how do they know which tree is theirs?" She put down her pencil. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the arithmetic book and turned to the page with the problems and said, "If a crow visits the same fence post every day for a week, and there are 7 fence posts on that side of the barn, and he visits each one once before returning to the first one, how many days before he's back at the beginning?" Ben turned from the window. 7, he said immediately. "Write it down. Show me the logic." He wrote it down, showing the logic, and then, without being asked, did the next problem on the page, which involved a farmer and his grain stores, and was significantly harder. Then he did the one after that. Then he looked up. "You did that on purpose," he said. "Did what?" "Made the math about the crow." She looked at him steadily. "I don't know what you're talking about." He grinned the extravagant grin. "You did, though." 3 more problems, she said. He did them. But the error she'd made was afterward, when Nathan came in from the fence line, and she mentioned, just in passing, just honestly, that Ben had a hard time staying with material that didn't interest him, and that she was working on finding ways to connect the lessons to things that engaged him. She did not anticipate how Nathan would take it. He stood at the sink washing his hands, and his back had gone very still in a way she was starting to recognize. "He's always been like that," he said. "I know. It's not a criticism." Clara managed it fine. The kitchen went quiet. Evelyn set down the dish she was drying. She looked at the back of his head. She thought about several things she could say, organized them by accuracy and by cost, and chose the one that was both accurate and, she hoped, survivable. "I'm not saying I can't manage it," she said. "I'm saying I'm learning how he learns. That takes time with any child." A pause. "I'm not Clara." He turned around. His expression was careful and complicated, and she could see something working behind it, something he was not entirely in control of. "I know that," he said. "I know you know it. I just wanted to say it out loud so we'd both heard it." She picked the dish back up. "I'm not trying to replace her. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it would be right if it were. I'm trying to do the job I said I would do, and I'm trying to do it well." She looked at him. "That's all?" He was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up his cup and went to the front room, and she stood in the kitchen and breathed. It was not an argument. She wasn't sure what it was, but it had put a crack in something, and she wasn't sure yet which direction the crack ran. The crack ran, it turned out, in an unexpected direction. 3 days later, Nathan came to the kitchen table while she was going over the boys' work in the evening after they'd gone to bed, and he sat down across from her without saying anything for a moment, and then said, "I talked to Clara's mother's sister before Clara died. She offered to come, to help with the boys. I told her we'd manage." Evelyn looked at him. "We didn't manage," he said. "Not well." His hands were flat on the table. "I kept waiting to get better at it. The part I wasn't good at. I thought it would come, given time." Some things don't come on their own, she said carefully. No. He looked at the papers spread between them. What is this? Lucas's essay on the Lewis and Clark expedition. He argues that the expedition's most significant contribution was cartographic rather than political, which is a genuinely interesting position for a 10-year-old. Something moved across Nathan's face. He wrote that himself? He wrote it. I helped him structure it. She turned the page toward him. Read the second paragraph. He read it. She watched him read it. His expression was the expression of a man who had known something was there and had not known quite how much. He doesn't show me his work, Nathan said. I know. He used to, before. She looked at the essay in his hands. She thought about what to say next. She thought about all the ways this was not her business, and all the ways it was, and the exact location of the line between them, and decided she had already crossed enough lines tonight to risk one more. He might again, she said. If you asked him. Nathan looked at her. You don't ask him things, she said. I've noticed. You tell him things, you give him tasks, you check his work, but you don't ask him about what he thinks or what he likes or how a thing went for him. She kept her voice even. I don't say this to criticize. I say it because I've been watching both of you, and it seems like two people who love each other and have forgotten they're allowed to just talk. Nathan set the essay down. You've been watching us, he said. I watch everything, she said. It's how I teach. He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he was going to stand up and leave. Instead, he said, What do I ask him about? She blinked. I mean it, he said. What? Where do I start? She thought about it. Ask him about the expedition. Tell him you read his essay and you want to know more about the cartography argument. He'll talk for an hour and he won't stop himself because it won't feel like a personal question. She paused. And then, when he's in it, ask him what he thinks about something, not a fact question. What he thinks. He'll remember that you asked. Nathan nodded slowly. He picked up the essay and set it aside, and he looked at the other papers on the table. And after a moment, he said, Ben told me you made the crow into a math problem. Ben has a loose interpretation of classroom confidentiality. He thought it was the best thing that ever happened to him. She looked at the table. She was trying not to let her face do anything embarrassing. He's a clever boy. He just needs the material to live somewhere he can find it. Nathan stood up. He picked up his coffee cup. He paused at the doorway to the hall. You're good at this, he said. He said it simply, without performance, the way he said most things, and then he went down the hall. She sat with the papers and the fire and the quiet house and did not let herself attach too much weight to it. He had said a thing. It was a true thing. She would take it at face value and nothing more. She was, after all, a practical woman in a practical arrangement. She repeated this to herself until she mostly believed it. The weeks that followed were, in their incremental way, a kind of thaw. Not dramatic, not linear, more like the way Montana spring comes. 3 warm days and then a freeze, and then warmer and then warm again, each cycle leaving the ground a little less hard. Evelyn established routines, because routines were the architecture of a stable life, and the boys needed architecture. Morning lessons from 7 to noon, with a short break at 9 for Ben to run outside and exhaust some of whatever energy he had accumulated overnight. Afternoons divided between practical work. She learned to bake bread that first month, badly, and then adequately, and then competently, which was its own kind of satisfaction, and supervised outdoor time when the weather allowed. Evenings for reading, all 3 of them, sometimes together and sometimes separately, in the warm front room. She taught Ben to play chess with a battered set she found in the bottom of the chest in her room, and he lost 6 games in a row with magnificent indifference, and then won the 7th and declared it the greatest victory in human history. She found, in the barn loft, a box of Clara's books. She brought them to the house and set them on the shelf without comment, and Nathan looked at them that evening and didn't say anything. And the next morning she saw that he had moved one of them, a slim volume of poetry, to the small table beside his chair in the front room. She did not remark on this. It was his book. It had always been his. Lucas was the one who cracked first, and it happened on a Thursday afternoon in late February in a way she had not anticipated. She was at the table correcting work alone in the house. Nathan had taken Ben to the south pasture, something about showing him how to evaluate fence conditions, an activity Ben had described to her that morning with the exact ratio of excitement and complaint that defined his personality. When she heard Lucas come in from outside, she heard him stop in the hall. She heard the particular silence of a person standing still when they thought no one was paying attention. Then he came into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway. He was still in his coat, and his face was cold reddened, and his boots were dripping on the floor, and he was holding something in his right hand, a piece of paper, crumpled and slightly damp. "What is this word?" he said. He held out the paper. She looked at it. It was a letter. She could see. Handwriting, older handwriting, feminine, not his work. "Where did you get this?" He hesitated for 1 second. "It was in the box, the one you brought from the barn." She looked at him. He was looking at the paper, not her. "Let me see." He crossed the kitchen and handed it to her. She smoothed it out. It was a letter, half finished, never sent. She could see that from the way it broke off mid-sentence. The handwriting was flowing and quick, the kind of handwriting that moved faster than it was thinking. The word he'd pointed at was in the third line. "Transcendent," she said. He looked at her. "It means beyond ordinary experience. Something so remarkable it goes past the usual limits of a thing." She paused. "Your mother used it to describe a sunset she saw from the North Ridge." He was very still. "She wrote," he said finally. It was not quite a question. "A lot of people write," Evelyn said. "Letters, journals, stories. It's one of the ways people hold on to things." She set the letter down carefully on the table. "Did you know she wrote?" He shook his head. Then he shook it again, and she understood that the second shake was about something else, something bigger, something that had been pressing at him for a while. I can't," he started, stopped. His jaw was set very tight. "I can't remember what she sounded like. Her voice. I've been trying and I can't." Evelyn stopped breathing for a moment. He was 10 years old and he was standing in a kitchen in February in a wet coat, and he was trying very hard not to fall apart, which he was managing, but only barely. His face had gone through something complicated and arrived at a particular expression she recognized. Not grief exactly, but the thing next to grief, the thing that is maybe worse, which is the fear of forgetting. She did not say anything right away. She had learned in 4 years of teaching that there is a specific kind of silence that is not emptiness but presence, and that some moments need that more than they need words. After a moment she said, "You remember other things about her?" He swallowed. "Yeah." "Tell me one." He looked up. "What?" "Tell me one thing you remember, not to me necessarily, just say it out loud. To the room if you want." He looked at the table. His hands were in his coat pockets. Outside, the sky was doing the thing it does in Montana in February, that long, flat gray that feels like it goes on forever. "She used to whistle when she did the dishes," he said. "Not songs, exactly. Just, it wasn't even the same thing twice, like she was making it up as she went." He stopped. Then, "I hated it sometimes, when I was trying to read and she was whistling in the kitchen." He stopped again, and his face did something involuntary. "I don't know why I—" He pressed his mouth shut. "Because you'd give anything to hear it now," Evelyn said quietly. He nodded. Once. Small. Like he didn't want to use up the motion. She looked at the letter on the table. "She wrote fast," Evelyn said. "You can tell from the way the letters lean. People who write fast usually think fast, which means they talked fast too, probably. And people who make up songs while they're doing dishes." She looked at him. She was interesting. I can tell that from one unfinished letter. Lucas looked at her. "You should keep that," Evelyn said, pushing the letter toward him gently. "It's yours." He picked it up. He folded it carefully, more carefully than it deserved given its condition, and put it in his coat pocket. He stood there for another moment, not moving. "Lucas." He looked at her. "Missing someone doesn't mean you're forgetting them. It means the opposite, actually." She picked her pencil back up. "Go change your boots before you track more water on the floor." His mouth did something that was not quite a smile, but it was the shape of where a smile might go if it was given enough time and the right conditions. He went and changed his boots. That evening at dinner, he told his father about the cartography essay. He did not offer it exactly. It came out in the middle of a conversation about the South Pasture, of all things. Nathan saying something about the old survey map, and Lucas saying that survey maps from that period were often inaccurate for reasons related to the tools available, which led to Nathan turning to look at his son with the same expression Evelyn had seen when Nathan read the essay, and then Nathan saying, "How do you know that?" And Lucas saying, "Evelyn has a book about it," and Nathan saying, "Show me after dinner," and Lucas, so carefully, so trying not to show it, saying, "Okay." Evelyn ate her dinner and did not say anything and did not let her face do anything that would embarrass anyone at the table. But under the table, she pressed the heel of her boot against the floor, hard, because she needed something solid, because this house was not healed. She was not naive about that. There were still evenings when Nathan sat alone in the front room, and the particular quality of his silence was a thing that filled the whole house, and she did not know how to reach it and had not decided whether to try. There were still mornings when she woke up in the small, east-facing room and lay in the early light, and thought about the strangeness of where she was and how she had arrived here, and felt the fear that never fully left, the quiet, constant fear that this too would be taken, that stability was not a thing she was allowed to keep. She was 31 years old, and she had rebuilt herself once already in Millhaven from scratch, and it had taken 4 years and it had been taken in 2 weeks, and the knowledge of that sat in her like a stone she hadn't figured out how to put down. But the house was warmer than it had been. She knew because Nathan had told her, not directly, not in those words, but in the way he'd said one evening when she was banking the fire for the night, that the boys had both slept through till 6 for the first time in months. He'd said it as information. She had taken it as something more, and then reminded herself not to, and then taken it as something more again, and given up on the back and forth. Warmth was warmth, whatever she called it. She pulled her coat tighter and went to bed and listened to the ranch breathe around her in the dark, the creak of timbers and the sound of wind in the eaves, and once the distant sound of an owl, and she thought that this was what she had fought for on that road in the blizzard. Not this specifically, she hadn't known this existed, but something like it. A place that was real and solid and asked only that she be real and solid in return. She could do that. She had always been able to do that. It was the rest of it. The things she hadn't planned for. The warmth she hadn't meant to feel when Nathan read his son's essay. The sound of 2 boys arguing about crow behavior in her kitchen. The specific, unbearable smallness of a crumpled letter from a woman she would never know. It was the rest of it that was going to be the problem. She fell asleep before she could finish the thought. Spring came to the Crow Ranch the way it always did in that part of Montana. Reluctantly, in fits, with long, cold reversals that made you question whether it had ever really arrived at all. By April, the snow had pulled back from the yard but still held the north-facing slopes, and the mud season had set in with its own particular misery, everything brown and sucking and difficult underfoot. Nathan said April was the worst month on a ranch, and Evelyn, after 6 weeks of it, was inclined to agree. But the house was different. She noticed it the way you notice a change in air pressure. Not all at once, not in any single moment you could point to, but gradually, in accumulation. The way Ben had started setting the table without being asked, arranging the plates with a precision he clearly felt was important. The way Lucas would sometimes appear in the kitchen doorway in the evening and lean against the frame and watch her work. Not saying anything, just present, in the way that children are present when they have decided a space belongs to them. The way Nathan had started saying good morning when he came in from the early chores, not as information exactly, more as a habit, the kind of habit that forms when a person has stopped thinking about whether to do a thing and just does it. Small things. She cataloged them the way she had always cataloged things, carefully, without attaching too much weight, with the part of her that was still the teacher in Millhaven, still the woman who had learned not to trust the ground until she'd tested it 3 times. But they added up. The trouble with things adding up was that eventually the sum became something you hadn't planned for. It happened on a Saturday in early May, which started as an ordinary Saturday. Nathan and his 2 ranch hands, Pete and a newer man named Garrett, working the south pasture fencing that had been undermined by the spring melt, and Evelyn at the house with the boys, doing what had become their Saturday custom, free reading in the morning and practical mathematics in the afternoon, which Ben had decided meant calculating things he actually wanted to know, like how many fence posts were on the entire property and whether the ranch's annual flour consumption could be reduced by switching bread recipes. They were working through the flower problem, which was more algebraically interesting than it had any right to be, when Lucas, who had been sitting across the table pretending to focus on his history reading while actually listening to the flower discussion, said without looking up, "You'd also need to account for density. Different recipes have different densities, so a loaf that uses less flour might also weigh less and feed fewer people per loaf." Evelyn looked at him. Ben said, "That's actually a problem." "It's a variable," Evelyn said. "Lucas, write that down. That's the next step in the model." Lucas put down his history book and picked up a pencil, and for the next 40 minutes, all three of them worked the flower problem together, and it became genuinely complex. And at one point, Evelyn made an arithmetic error that Lucas caught and corrected with the careful tact of a person who has decided correcting someone is acceptable if done without gloating. And Evelyn told him he was right, and that she'd made the error because she'd carried a number incorrectly, and she showed him where, and his expression when she did. The slight widening, the quick look down to verify, the satisfaction of understanding how a mistake works rather than just that it exists. That expression was one she stored away somewhere she didn't examine too closely. Nathan came in for lunch and found three people at his kitchen table arguing about bread density, which was not a sentence he'd expected to form that day. He stood in the doorway looking at the papers spread between them, at Ben's diagram of a theoretical optimal loaf, at Lucas using a ruler to confirm a measurement, and he said, "What is happening?" "We're fixing the flour problem," Ben said. "There's a flour problem." "There is now." Nathan looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. His face was doing the thing it had started doing sometime in March. A particular quality of almost expression, something that lived right at the edge of showing itself before he put it back. She had stopped pretending she didn't notice it. She had not stopped pretending she didn't care. "I'll make lunch," she said. He sat down and looked at Lucas's calculations without saying anything, and after a moment he said, "Your numbers are right." Lucas looked up. "The density variable. Your numbers are right." Nathan picked up the paper. "I haven't thought about this since I was in school." "Were you good at mathematics?" Lucas asked. Not cautiously, just directly, the way he asked questions when a question was actually about something he wanted to know. Nathan considered this with more seriousness than it strictly required. "Decent. Better at geometry than figures. Measuring and angles made sense to me in a way that long division didn't, not until later." He set the paper down. "Your grandfather was good at figures. He could calculate board feet in his head faster than most men could do it with a pencil." Lucas looked at the paper. Then he said, "I didn't know that." "I don't talk about him enough," Nathan said. It came out simply, without performance, the way Evelyn had noticed he said true things that cost him something, just flatly, as fact. "I should do that more." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Ben said, "Was Grandpa good at bread?" Nathan looked at his younger son. "No," he said. "He was a terrible cook. He made biscuits once that Pete's dog wouldn't eat." Ben dissolved. It was the kind of laughter that is involuntary and total and slightly alarming in its intensity. Lucas made a sound that was not quite laughter, but was in the same family. Nathan sat back in his chair, and there was something on his face that Evelyn saw before he could put it back. Something wide open and hurting and glad at the same time. The expression of a man who had forgotten for a moment that grief was his permanent weather. She turned back to the stove and gave him the room to put himself back together. It was the last ordinary meal they ate for a while. 3 weeks later, near the end of May, Pete came to the house in the early evening with a look on his face that Evelyn had learned to read by then. Tight, deliberate, the look of a man carrying information he doesn't want to deliver. She was on the porch when he rode in, taking advantage of a rare warm evening to sit outside with a book, and she saw his face before he saw her, and she put the book down. "Mr. Crow inside?" Pete said. "Kitchen," she said. "What's wrong?" Pete hesitated. He was a compact, weathered man in his late 40s who had worked the Crow Ranch for 11 years, long enough that he would have known Clara, long enough that he watched Evelyn with the particular measured assessment of someone who has not fully decided where his loyalties should shift. He was not unkind. He was just careful about it. "There's talk from the Henderson spread," he said, "about the Aldridge gang." She knew the name, in the way that anyone living in that stretch of Montana in that period knew the name, and not from personal experience, but from the way names travel when they are attached to something people are afraid of. Colton Aldridge. He'd come out of the Wyoming border country with 3 or 4 men whose histories were various shades of bad, and in the previous 2 years he had made himself known through a specific kind of grievance work, not random outlaw violence, but targeted, patient, the kind that came from old scores and festered ones. "Nathan," she said, standing up. He was already at the door. He'd heard Pete ride in. The conversation that followed happened in the yard. The 3 of them, while the evening light went gold and then orange over the Beartooth Range, and Evelyn stood slightly to the side and listened and felt the information settle into her in a cold, specific way. Colton Aldridge had a grievance against Nathan. This was not new information to Nathan. She could see that from his face, from the slight tightening that was recognition rather than surprise. 2 years ago, Nathan had given testimony at a land dispute hearing in Harlan that had gone against the Aldridge family's claim on a grazing parcel. Nathan's testimony had not been the deciding factor. There had been 3 other witnesses, a surveyor's report, recorded deeds going back 20 years, but Aldridge, by multiple reports, was not a man who distributed blame proportionally. "Henderson's hand says they were seen on the Miller Road 2 days ago," Pete said. 4 men asking questions about the crow spread. Nathan looked at the mountains for a moment. "How reliable is Henderson's man?" "Reliable enough." A pause. "You tell Garrett?" "He knows. He says he'll stay." Nathan nodded. Then he looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "I want the boys in the house," he said. "Tomorrow they don't go past the yard without one of us." "All right," she said. "This might come to nothing," he said. "Aldridge has made noise before and not followed through." "And when he has followed through?" Nathan's jaw tightened. "When he has, he's come at night. At the buildings." He looked back at Pete. "Check the rifle rack in the barn. Count what we have." Pete rode back across the yard and Nathan stood for a moment longer, looking at the Miller Road in the distance. And then he looked at Evelyn again with an expression she couldn't fully read. "I'm telling you," he said, "not because I want you to be afraid, because you need to know. I understand. If it comes to it, Nathan," she kept her voice even, "I grew up in a house with a father who kept a shotgun above the kitchen door and taught all 3 of his children to use it." She met his eyes. "I know what if it comes to it means. Tell me where you keep the extra ammunition." He looked at her for a long moment, then he told her. The waiting was its own kind of endurance. The days that followed had a surface normalcy that was slightly unreal. Lessons in the morning, ranch work in the afternoon, dinner, evening, bed. But underneath it there was a tightness to everything, a quality of attention that exhausted without showing. Nathan and Pete and Garrett rotated watch duties in the evenings, 2-hour stretches, and Nathan started sleeping lighter than he already did, and Evelyn knew this because she was sleeping lighter too, and some nights she heard him get up and move through the house, checking the doors, checking the windows. And she would lie still and listen to his footsteps and match her breathing to the sound of him until he went back to bed. She told the boys as little as she reasonably could, and as much as she had to. She told Lucas that there might be some trouble and that she needed him to be reliable about staying in the yard. And he had looked at her with the 10-year-old version of the assessing look she'd learned from his father and said, "What kind of trouble?" She said the kind that men with bad intentions sometimes bring to ranches in isolated country, and that his father was handling it, and that the most useful thing Lucas could do was exactly what she asked without argument. Lucas had nodded once, with a seriousness that sat a little heavy on a face that young. She told Ben there was a possibility of some dangerous men passing through and that she needed him close to the house. Ben, being Ben, had 17 immediate questions. She answered 6 of them, redirected 4, and promised to explain the rest later, which seemed to satisfy him enough that he went back to his book without further escalation. What she did not tell either of them was that she had started waking up at 3 in the morning with her heart going too fast, lying in the dark in the small east-facing room, thinking about Nathan's face in the yard when he said, "When he has followed through," the flat, knowing quality of it, the way a man looks when he has accepted a thing into himself and stopped fighting the fact of it. She had not come this far to lose it to a man with a grudge and nothing better to do with himself. The night they came, it was a Wednesday. She knew it was Wednesday because she had been thinking that afternoon that Thursday was Lucas's birthday. He was turning 11, and she had been planning quietly to make the apple cake that Ben had described as Clara's specialty, using the recipe she'd found written on a slip of paper tucked into one of the kitchen books. She had been thinking about whether to tell Nathan she'd found it or simply put the cake on the table, whether the gesture would land as kindness or as something that crossed a line she hadn't mapped yet. She fell asleep thinking about it and woke at 11:15 to a sound she couldn't identify. She lay still. Montana Ranch at night was not a quiet place. There was wind and animals and the house's own settling, but this was a sound that did not belong to any of those categories. It had a specific human quality, a deliberateness, and it was coming from the direction of the barn. She was out of bed and pulling on her boots before her mind had fully articulated why. She was in the hallway moving toward Nathan's room when she heard the first voice outside, low, carrying, the tone of a man issuing instructions, and then footsteps on the porch. She knocked on Nathan's door once, hard. He opened it immediately. He was dressed. He had the rifle. "Front porch," she said. "At least one. I heard voices from the barn direction, too." He was already moving, and she was behind him, and then he stopped and turned and said in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, "Wake the boys. The root cellar. You know where it is. I know where it is. Take them there and stay." She looked at him. She wanted to argue, and she understood with full clarity that this was not the moment for it. She said, "Be careful," and turned and went for the boys' room. Ben was deep asleep in the way that only young children sleep, total and unreachable, and she had to shake him twice. And she put her hand over his mouth before he could make a sound and bent close to his ear and said, "Quiet. Don't make a sound. We need to go downstairs right now." And his eyes went wide and he nodded under her hand. Lucas was already sitting up. "I heard it too," he whispered. "Boots on," she said. "Now." They went down the back stairs in the dark, her hand on Ben's shoulder, Lucas moving silently behind her, and she could hear from the front of the house the sound of the door opening and Nathan's voice, low, controlled, saying something she couldn't make out, and then another voice, higher and rough-edged, saying something back, and then the unmistakable sound of wood striking wood. She got the boys to the root cellar door in the kitchen floor. She lifted the latch. She looked at Lucas in the dim light from the banked stove, and she said, "Down, both of you. Do not come up until you hear my voice or your father's." "What about you?" Ben whispered. His voice was very small, but his eyes were focused. "I'll be right here." "Evelyn." "Lucas." She held his eyes. "I need you to take care of your brother. That's your job right now. Can you do that?" He looked at her for one long second. Then he took Ben's arm and they went down into the dark, and she lowered the door and slid the interior latch, and she straightened up and turned back toward the front of the house. There were at least 3 of them inside by then. She could hear it, the weight of multiple bodies, the particular chaos of a space being moved through without care for what it contained. She could hear Nathan's voice, still controlled, still trying to hold something, and another voice telling him something in the kind of flat, effectless tone that meant the speaker had decided where this was going already. She crossed the kitchen to the shelf beside the window. Nathan had told her 3 weeks ago where the extra ammunition was kept, and she had taken the information and stored it, the way she stored all practical things, in the part of her mind that filed away what might be needed later. The shotgun was under the kitchen shelf board. The board Nathan had shown her was loose. She pulled it up. Her hands were not shaking. She noticed this the way you notice strange things under stress. As a piece of information, neutral, relevant, she loaded it. The sound of it was loud in the kitchen, and she knew anyone who knew what that sound meant would hear it, and she did not care. She went toward the front room. There were 3 men. One was Colton Aldridge himself. She knew this not because she had ever seen him, but because he had the quality of the man in charge, the specific way a person holds space when they have been in charge of violent things long enough that it has become physical, settled into the shoulders and the jaw. He was between 40 and 50, lean, with a beard that needed cutting and eyes that were doing what eyes do when a person is working themselves up to something. He had Nathan backed against the far wall, and Nathan had his hands visible, and the rifle that had been in Nathan's hands was not in Nathan's hands anymore. The second man was near the door to the hall. The third was ransacking the shelves along the east wall, pulling things down. None of them had heard her come in yet. "Where's the deed box?" Aldridge was saying. I know you have a deed box, Crow. Every ranchman keeps a deed box, and I want what's in it. There's nothing in it that belongs to you, Nathan said. That's a matter of ongoing disagreement. Aldridge's voice had almost a conversational quality, which was worse than if he'd been shouting. What's your current inventory of cash? I'm a rancher in May. What do you think? I think men like you always have more than they let on. Aldridge moved slightly. And I think after tonight you're going to have a hard time arguing about that land claim to anyone, because you're not going to be in a condition to argue about much. That was when Nathan's eyes found Evelyn in the doorway. He did not react. He was, she understood in that moment, a better actor than she had given him credit for, because his face did not change by a single degree when he saw her standing there with the shotgun. He kept his eyes on Aldridge and said, You came all this way for a deed box. I came all this way for what's owed. Nothing is owed. The man near the door shifted and Evelyn said, Don't. All three of them turned. In the lamplight of the front room, she was aware of how she must look. Nightgown, boots, hair loose, the shotgun leveled with both hands in a grip her father had drilled into her at age 12 on a frost-covered field in eastern Montana. Stance wide, weight forward, absolutely still. She was aware of it from the outside, the way you sometimes are in moments of extreme focus. That's a woman, said the man near the door, with an idiot's surprise. That's my wife, Nathan said. And his voice on those two words had a quality she had never heard from him before, something low and certain that had nothing practical about it. Aldridge looked at her. He was calculating. She could see it. He was a man who had done this enough times to read situations quickly, and she let him read it because what he would read, she hoped, she counted on, was that she had loaded the weapon and she knew how to use it, and she was not going to give him the space to call the question. Lady, he said, you want to put that down before someone— I don't, she said. There are three of us. There are, she agreed, and I have 2 shots in this gun, which means one of you is walking out of here and 2 of you aren't, and I haven't decided which one yet, but if you'd like to help me decide by moving first, I'm happy to let you. The room was entirely still. The man near the door was looking at Aldridge. The third man had stopped pulling things off the shelves. Aldridge was looking at Evelyn with the expression of a man recalculating, and she could see him doing it, could see him measuring something he hadn't measured before he came in tonight. Nathan moved in the half-second that Aldridge's eyes dropped to the shotgun. He was across the room faster than a man with a bad knee had any right to be, and he had Aldridge's arm behind his back before the man could turn, and then the whole room erupted. The man near the door made a decision, and it was the wrong one. He came at Nathan from the side, and Evelyn pivoted, and the shotgun described an arc, and she caught him across the jaw with the stock, which was not what the gun was designed for, but worked on the same principle as a fence post, and he went down hard. The third man ran. He simply turned and went out the front door and kept going, which she would think about later as the sanest decision anyone made that night. Nathan had Aldridge down. He had his knee in the man's back and Aldridge's arm at an angle that had caused him to stop fighting, and he was breathing hard through his nose, and Aldridge was saying something into the floorboards that was either a threat or a curse, or both. Evelyn stood with the shotgun and watched the door. After a moment, Nathan said, You all right? It was not quite a question. Yes, she said. There were 4 men, one outside. Pete and Garrett. I know. He was still breathing hard. I need rope, kitchen, bottom drawer, left side. She went and got it. She brought it back and she held the shotgun while Nathan bound Aldridge's wrists, and then she stood over the man on the floor with the shotgun and watched him while Nathan dragged Aldridge to the corner. And she was remarkably calm, which she knew was not a permanent condition, but was the condition she had right now, and she intended to use it. It was 20 minutes later. Aldridge and the other man secured in the corner, Pete coming in from the yard with a cut on his forearm, and the news that the 4th man had been unhorsed and subdued outside, Garrett riding for the nearest lawman. That Nathan came to where she was standing in the front room doorway and stopped close to her. She was starting to shake slightly. Not badly, just the delayed arrival of the fear that had been waiting at the back of everything. The boys, she said. Pete'll stay with them here. I know. Go. She lowered the shotgun. Her arms were tired. I'll get the boys up from the cellar. He didn't move immediately. He was looking at her in the lamplight with an expression she did not have a name for and had not seen before on any face, not just his, an expression that was trying to contain something it was not equipped to contain. He looked wrecked and concentrated at the same time, like a man who has had something confirmed that he was hoping was not true, because the truth of it changed the shape of things, and the shape of things was already complicated. "Nathan," she said. "You could have stayed with the boys," he said. "I could have." "You chose not to." She met his eyes. "Someone had to even the numbers." She kept her voice level. "I didn't like the numbers." He stood there looking at her, and she stood there looking back at him, and neither of them said what was underneath the exchange, because the room still had two bound men in it, and Pete was in the kitchen, and the night was not over. But it was said anyway. In the looking. In the specific quality of the space between them that had been a careful managed distance for 4 months, and was no longer quite that, because something had happened tonight that could not be unlooked at or set back the way it was. She turned and went to get her boys. Ben came out of the root cellar with his hair pointing in 3 directions and immediately demanded a full accounting of what had occurred, and she told him that some men had come to the ranch and caused trouble, and that his father and Pete had dealt with it, and he said, "And you?" She said she had helped, and he said, with the shotgun?" And she said, "Ben." And he said, "I heard it. It was loud." And Lucas came up behind him and looked at her and said nothing, just looked, and she looked back, and it was enough. She made them both sit at the kitchen table, and she made hot milk with honey. It was the only thing she could think of that was both practical and kind. And she sat with them until Ben's recounting of his time in the root cellar became sufficiently elaborate that she knew the immediate fear had converted itself into story, which was how Ben processed most things, and that he would be all right. Lucas drank his milk and did not say much. But at some point, while she was watching Ben draw a map of the root cellar on the back of his arithmetic paper, Lucas reached across the table without ceremony and touched her hand once, just briefly, just for a moment. Then he pulled his hand back and looked at his milk. She looked at the table. Outside, the Montana night was doing what it did. Indifferent, enormous, going right on being itself without any concern for what had happened inside this house. The mountains were out there in the dark, bone white and permanent. The wind moved through the timber to the north and came to nothing. What had been broken into tonight was not just a house, and what it held was not just a door. The lawmen from Harlan arrived before dawn with 2 deputies and took Aldridge and his men away in the gray pre-morning light, while the ranch dogs barked and Ben watched from the porch, wrapped in a blanket with the focused attention of someone filing everything away for future retelling. Lucas stood beside him and did not say much. Nathan spoke with the lawman, a man named Caswell, wide through the chest with a gray mustache and the unhurried manner of someone who had cleaned up other people's messes for 30 years. For a long time in the yard, and Evelyn listened from inside the door and heard the shape of the conversation without most of the words. When it was done and the horses had gone and the yard was quiet again, Nathan came back inside and stood in the kitchen and looked at the front room doorway where the lamp was still burning from the night before, and he looked at it for a long time. "Caswell says it'll go to trial in Harlan," he said. "He'll need a statement from both of us." "All right," Evelyn said. "Could be a while before it's settled." "I understand." He turned and looked at her. She was at the stove, making coffee because it was the thing to do at 5 in the morning after a night like that, and her hands were steady, but her eyes were tired in a way that went past sleeplessness. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across the front room. That same uncontained quality, that same working at something behind the face, and she looked back at him and waited. He said, "You should sleep." She said, "So should you." A pause. "The boys, Pete's with them." She poured 2 cups. She set one on the table in front of his chair without looking at him. "Sit down, Nathan." He sat down. She sat across from him. The kitchen was very quiet, the early light just beginning to show at the window, thin and uncertain the way May light is before it commits. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I've been thinking," he said, "since last night. I've been thinking about a lot of things." She waited. "I keep coming back to one thing." He looked at the cup. "When I saw you in that doorway, when I saw you standing there." He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment. "I've been on this land for 15 years. I've had hard seasons. I've had bad men. I've had Clara and after Clara. None of it. He stopped again. None of it scared me the way the 2 seconds before I saw you in that doorway scared me. The kitchen was very still. I didn't know you were there, he said. And for 2 seconds I thought you were in the cellar with the boys, which was where I told you to be, which was the sensible place to be, and I thought, he set the cup down. It was a different kind of scared than I'd had before, not scared for myself. Scared that something had happened to you specifically, that you specifically were. He pressed his mouth shut. I don't know how to say this without sounding like a fool. You don't sound like a fool, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. I've been telling myself for 4 months, he said, that this was a practical arrangement, that I was grateful for what you'd done for the boys and for the house, and that was the shape of it, that was the whole of it, and I was not going to. He looked up. I was not going to make it complicated, for you, because you'd had enough complicated, and you'd come here under circumstances that were not. He stopped for the 3rd time, and she could see him sorting through words and discarding them one after another, which was unusual for a man who normally said exactly what he meant to say on the first try. You deserved to be able to decide your own things, he said finally, without pressure from me, without feeling like you owed me something beyond what we agreed. Evelyn looked at her coffee cup. She thought about the careful distance she had maintained for 4 months, the cataloging of small things, the part of her that had kept its own counsel, that had said practical arrangement to itself in the mornings, like a person repeating directions so they wouldn't get lost. Nathan, she said. He looked at her. I've been doing the same thing, she said. He was very still. Not for the same reasons. Mine were. She considered. I've had 2 things taken from me that I built carefully. My position in Millhaven. Before that, a situation I thought was stable that wasn't. She looked at the window. I stopped trusting the ground about 3 years ago. I've been testing it before I stepped since then. She looked back at him. What's been happening in this house? With you? With the boys? I've been telling myself it was the work. That what I felt in the mornings when things were going well was professional satisfaction. That when you. She stopped herself. That it was gratitude. On both sides. A good working arrangement that produced good results. And now? He said. She looked at him directly. Now Lucas touched my hand at the kitchen table and I nearly came apart at the seams, and I was standing in your front room pointing a shotgun at a man because I could not, because the thought of something happening to this family was more than I could. She stopped. She put both hands flat on the table, which was something she did when she needed to stay grounded. I am not good at this, she said. I want you to know that. I taught other people's children for 4 years, and I am significantly better at that than at this. He looked at her hands on the table. Evelyn, he said, I know it complicates the arrangement. It changes the arrangement, he said. It changes it entirely. She looked at him. Because I don't want a practical arrangement anymore, he said. I want to come in from the barn in the morning and have you tell me there's a flower problem. I want to watch you argue with Ben about crow behavior. I want to. He stopped. Something moved across his face that was difficult to look at directly, that had too much of him in it. I loved Clara, he said. I need you to know that. That's not going away. I'm not going to pretend it is or act like what I feel for you is the same thing, because it isn't. It's a different thing, and I think that's allowed. I think a man is allowed to love 2 people in 2 different ways at 2 different times, and I think. He stopped. I think Clara would have liked you. I think she would have argued with you about teaching methods, and then admitted you were right and pretended she'd thought of it herself. A sound came out of Evelyn that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, and was entirely embarrassing, and she pressed her hand over her mouth for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. That was. Don't apologize, he said. He was looking at her with something that was full and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him before, and it was terrifying, and she did not look away from it. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. You've had approximately 4 hours of sleep, and there were men with guns in this house last night, and that's not a fair moment to ask anyone to. I love you, she said. He stopped. She had not planned to say it. It had come out with the directness of something that had been under pressure for long enough that it simply went when the pressure shifted, and she sat with it in the kitchen and felt the word hang there, too simple for what it contained. I know how that sounds, she said. under these circumstances. I know it sounds like... It sounds true, he said. She looked at him. It sounds like a true thing said out loud, he said, and I have not heard enough of those in my life to mistake one when it comes. The sun had finally committed to the morning. It came through the east window and put a long stripe of light across the kitchen floor between them, and the two of them sat in it and looked at each other across the table and across the 4 months and across everything that had gone into those 4 months. And it was not comfortable, and it was not simple, and it was not the neat resolution of anything, because they were two people with histories and scar tissue and competing kinds of caution, and that does not become uncomplicated because you say a true thing out loud. But the saying of it changed the room. Nathan reached across the table. He put his hand over hers, the one still flat against the table, and he left it there. And she turned her hand over and held on. They sat there until Ben's voice erupted from the back of the house, demanding to know if breakfast was happening, and if so, when. And the moment broke the way moments do. Not badly, just back into the ordinary world that was still waiting for them. And Evelyn pulled her hand back and stood up and went to make breakfast, and she was smiling in a way that she did not try to manage and did not particularly care who saw. The weeks after the attack had their own particular texture. There was the practical aftermath, the statement to Caswell, the trip to Harlan for the formal deposition, the business of the front room, which had to be put back in order, the fence on the east side where one of Aldridge's men had cut the wire to move through the property. There was the conversation with Pete and Garrett, who stayed, who were paid a bonus Nathan could not easily afford, and gave anyway, who said nothing about the night beyond what was necessary and went back to work. There was the shifting of things between Nathan and Evelyn, which happened not in a single moment, but in a series of them, small and ordinary and specific. The first time he touched her face, briefly, in passing, in the kitchen, just a hand against her cheek for a moment as he moved past her, the way you touch something you're no longer afraid to touch. The first time she fell asleep in the front room chair with a book and woke to find a blanket over her that had not been there before. The first conversation that went past practical matters, past the boys and the ranch and the business of the day, into the territory of who they each actually were. Nathan telling her about his father, about what it had been like to inherit land he wasn't sure he wanted at 22, and then realized somewhere around 25 that he wanted it more than he'd known how to say. Evelyn telling him about the year before Millhaven, the situation she had referred to only obliquely before, a man she had trusted and shouldn't have, a year that had cost her something she was still, occasionally, trying to recover. He listened to that without saying anything for a long time. Then he said, "Did he hurt you?" It was not quite a question. "Not the way you mean," she said. "Not physically. He just..." She looked at the fire. He was very convincing, and I was 27 and I wanted to believe him, which is the real problem when you look back on it, because the wanting to believe is your own, and you can't blame someone else for it entirely. You can blame someone for being convincing about the wrong things, Nathan said. Can you? Yes, he said, simply, flatly. You can. She looked at him. He was looking at the fire, his jaw set in the way it got when he had decided something was a fact and was not going to be argued out of it. She thought about arguing anyway, because she had spent 3 years arguing with herself about exactly this, about the exact location of the fault line. She decided to let him have the certainty on her behalf, just this once. It felt strangely like being handed something she hadn't known she was carrying. The boys watched all of this with varying degrees of subtlety. Ben watched with no subtlety whatsoever. He had noticed the changed quality of things approximately 48 hours after the attack and had responded by becoming even more openly enthusiastic about Evelyn's presence at the ranch, as though her continued occupancy was a project that required his active promotion. He started telling her things about the ranch's history with the proprietary enthusiasm of someone showing off an inheritance. This is the tree that fell on the barn in the ice storm of '91. This is where Lucas fell off the fence that time and cried, but won't admit it. This is where Mama used to sit in the evenings in summer because the light was good. He offered these items without ceremony, without apparent awareness of what he was doing, which was folding her into the story of the place. Lucas did it differently. One afternoon in late June, a warm afternoon when the summer had finally settled in for real and the meadows beyond the east fence were long and green, Lucas came to find Evelyn in the kitchen and said, without preamble, "I want to show you something." She followed him out and across the yard and through the gate to the north path, which she knew led eventually to the timber but had not walked all the way. He walked fast the way he always did, not checking to see if she was keeping pace, which she found oddly companionable. They went up through the pasture and into the tree line and along a trail she would not have found on her own, and came out after 15 minutes onto a shelf of land on the hillside that looked out over the entire ranch. She stopped. She could see all of it: the house, the barn, the outbuildings, the fenced pastures, the Miller Road in the distance, and beyond it the country going west in long rolls toward the mountains. The afternoon light was doing something to it that she did not have words for, the particular quality of late June light in Montana that seems to come from inside things rather than outside them. Mama used to call it the overview, Lucas said. He was standing with his hands in his pockets looking out at it. She said if you ever felt like the ranch was too much, too loud, or too much work, or too many things going wrong at once, you should come up here and look at the whole of it, because from up here it just looks like what it is, which is a good piece of land that people have been working hard on. Evelyn looked at the ranch spread below her and felt something in her chest settle that had been unsteady for a long time. Not gone. The unsteadiness was not gone. She was too honest to pretend that, but quieter, manageable. It is a good piece of land, she said. It's going to be mine and Ben's eventually, Lucas said. Ben says he wants to raise horses. He changes his mind about what kind every few weeks. A pause. I want to keep it the way it is. What Papa does with it. The cattle, the pasture rotation. It works because he understands the land. I want to understand it like that. You will, Evelyn said. He looked at her. How do you know? Because you understand everything you decide to understand. I've watched you for 6 months. She looked back at the ranch. You're going to be a good steward of this place, Lucas, when the time comes. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, Papa is different now. Since you. He said it without accusation, without anything except the directness that was his consistent quality. Good different. He talks more. He asked me last week what I thought about the south pasture rotation and actually listened to my answer. He didn't used to do that. A pause. He used to be like there was glass between him and everything. You could see him, but you couldn't. He stopped, apparently frustrated with the limits of the metaphor. He was grieving, Evelyn said. I know. I was grieving too. He looked at the mountains. But I'm still here, and he was so far inside it that sometimes it felt like I was going to lose him too, even though he was right there. His jaw was set in the exact way his father's jaw set. I don't say this to... Lucas. She looked at him. You don't have to explain yourself. You're telling me something true, and I'm listening to it. He looked at her. Something in his face released slightly, the way a knotted thing releases when the right pressure is applied. I know you're not my mother, he said. I don't need you to be that. I know Ben says things sometimes that make it sound like he thinks... He stopped. But Ben is 6, and the world is simple when you're 6. He's 7 now, she said. Since last month. 7. A slight eye roll that was so purely adolescent it startled a smile out of her. The world is simple when you're 7. What do you need? She said. From me. Not from the arrangement, not from what makes sense for the household. What do you need? He thought about it with the seriousness he brought to every actual question. I need you to stay, he said. That's all. I need you to not be another thing that goes. She looked at the boy standing beside her on the hillside, 11 years old and carrying things no 11-year-old should carry, and she thought about the crumpled letter in his coat pocket and the flower problem on the kitchen table, and the way he'd touched her hand in the dark after the worst night she'd had in years. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He nodded. Once, small. The same nod his father used when something had been decided and there was no need to say more. They stood there a while longer looking at the ranch below them before they went back down. It was Nathan who brought up the wedding. Not in the way she'd expected. Not formally. Not with the deliberate approach he'd used for the original proposal. The careful laying out of terms. He brought it up on a Tuesday evening in July, sitting on the porch after dinner while the boys were inside, the summer dark coming on slow the way it does in Montana, where the sky holds the light long past when it should, and he said without looking at her, I'd like to do it again. She looked at him. Do what again? Get married. He was looking at the yard, the way he looked at things he was working out. Not the way we did it the first time. That was a pause. That was necessary. I don't regret it, but it was not. He turned and looked at her. I'd like to stand up in front of people we know and say what is actually true. Not an arrangement, not a transaction. He held her eyes. You deserve to have that, to have people know what you are, who you are. Not Evelyn Crow who came out of a blizzard and made a deal, but Evelyn Crow who... He stopped. His jaw worked. You held this family together, he said. When I didn't know how to, you figured out what we needed and you did it. And then, when men with guns came through the door, you stood in the dark and you held the line. Something moved across his face. I want to stand next to you in front of people and mean it, every word. She looked at him for a long moment. When? She said. September, he said, when the summer work is done. We could do it here, at the ranch. Pete and Garrett, Caswell and his wife, people from Harlan who've been decent. Anyone you want. She thought about who she would invite. The list was shorter than it should have been, but it was real. A woman named Margaret, who had taught alongside her briefly in a town before Millhaven, a former student's family who had written her when she'd left. She thought about her sister in Billings, the letter she had not written yet, the one that would require explaining a great deal of ground. My sister, she said. I'd want her there if she'll come. Write to her, Nathan said. Tell her everything. Let her decide. She looked at him. Everything? You went through a blizzard and came out the other side, he said. You don't have to protect anyone from the story. She sat with that for a moment. There was something uncomfortable in it, and something deeply relieving in equal measure, which was the specific mixture of feelings that true things tended to produce. All right, she said, September. He reached over and took her hand the way he had taken it in the kitchen in May, the same simple, deliberate gesture. And she held on the way she had then, and they sat on the porch while the sky did its slow Montana work, and the boys' voices drifted through the window behind them, arguing about something that had been important enough to argue about at 8 in the evening on a Tuesday in July. The letter to her sister took 4 drafts. The first was too careful. The second overcorrected and became too raw. The third was accurate but read like a legal document. The fourth started, Margaret, I need to tell you about a winter I had, and I need you to read all of it before you respond because the beginning sounds very bad and the middle sounds very strange, and the ending is something I still don't entirely have words for. But it's true, all of it, and I think you should know. She sent the 4th draft. Her sister arrived in late August, 3 weeks before the wedding, on the Harlan coach. She was 2 years younger than Evelyn, smaller and darker, with the same careful eyes and a mouth that moved faster than the eyes. And she stood in the yard of the Crow Ranch with her travel bag and looked at the house and the barn and the mountains and then at her sister and said, I should have come sooner. You didn't know sooner, Evelyn said. I should have written back when you... Margaret stopped. Her eyes were bright. I should have. You're here now, Evelyn said. They stood in the yard and Evelyn showed her the ranch and the house and introduced her to the boys, and Ben immediately told her in great detail about the night of the attack, including several embellishments that had crept in over the 2 months of retelling, and Margaret listened with an expression that went through several stages, and at the end she looked at Evelyn with an intensity that was difficult to meet, and said, You pointed a shotgun at him. At them, Evelyn said. 3 of them. Margaret looked at her for a moment longer. Then she said, Mama would have been absolutely insufferable about this. I know, Evelyn said. She would have told everyone within a 20-mile radius. She would have written it on her Christmas cards, Margaret said. They both laughed, standing in the yard of the ranch, and it was the kind of laughter that comes from somewhere old, somewhere shared, and it left Evelyn feeling lighter than she had in a long time. Nathan shook Margaret's hand when he met her and said little and let the 2 sisters have the evening to themselves, which Evelyn noticed and stored away as one more piece of evidence in the ongoing case she was building for who he was. The case had considerable evidence by now. She was no longer sure what verdict she'd been looking for. The verdict had been returned some months ago. She was just still reading through the file. She met Nathan in the hall that night, late, both of them up past when the house had gone quiet. And they stood in the dim hallway with the lamp turned low, and she said, Thank you for letting her come. She's your family, he said. Family doesn't need my permission to come. She looked at him. This is your house. It's your house too, he said. That was in the original terms. You remember the original terms? I remember everything about that morning, he said. You sat down across from me and put your hands flat on the table and looked me dead in the eye and told me what you needed and what you wouldn't give up, and you were 30 pounds underweight from a blizzard and you still didn't flinch. He looked at her steadily. That morning I thought I was solving a problem. Turns out I was the one being solved. She stared at him. That's a strange thing to say, she said. Probably, he said. He did not look particularly embarrassed by it. But it's true. She stood in the hallway with the lamp throwing shadows and looked at this man she had married in a courthouse in January because there was no other choice. This man who had fed her soup and given her a room and shaken her hand across a barn and said, "That's my wife," with a certainty that had nothing practical in it. And she thought about all the things she had told herself this was, all the careful names she had given it to keep it from being what it was. She was tired of the careful names. "Nathan," she said. "Evelyn," he said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. The rough stubble he never quite managed to stay ahead of, and she felt him go very still under her hand, and then his hand came up and covered hers. And they stood like that in the hall for a moment, just still, just present, just the two of them in a house that had been broken and was being put back together one piece at a time. "September," she said. "September," he said. She dropped her hand and went back to her room, and she lay in the dark in the small east-facing room that was hers and listened to the ranch at night and thought that she would not be sleeping in this room much longer, and that the thought of it was frightening in the way that all real things are frightening, and also that she was not afraid of it in any way that mattered. The fear was just weather now, and she knew how to walk in weather. The September wedding was not elegant. Evelyn had not expected it to be and had not wanted it to be. And Nathan was constitutionally incapable of elegant, which she had come to understand was one of his better qualities. What it was real. 30 people in the yard of the Crow Ranch on a Saturday afternoon when the aspens had just started turning, their leaves going gold against the blue of the September sky. And Pete had built a low platform out of good timber so that people in the back could see, and Garrett's wife had brought flowers from her kitchen garden that were mostly past their prime but still holding on, which Evelyn felt was appropriate. Margaret stood to Evelyn's left in a blue dress and kept her composure until the moment Nathan said his vows, at which point she stopped keeping it, which set off a chain reaction in the front row that reached Ben in approximately 4 seconds. Ben wept with the same wholehearted lack of self-consciousness he brought to everything and did not appear to find this embarrassing. Lucas stood next to his father and did not cry, but at one point he reached over and took Nathan's hand briefly, the way he'd taken Evelyn's hand in the kitchen months ago, and Nathan looked down at his older son, and something passed between them that had no name and needed none. The judge who married them was not Aldridge from Harlan. That name had an unfortunate other association now, but a woman named Ferris from the county seat who had been recommended by Caswell and who conducted the ceremony with the brisk competence of someone who had done this many times and still found it worth doing properly. She looked at the two of them over her papers before she began and said, "You've already been married once. You know what you're getting into. We know better now," Nathan said. Ferris looked at Evelyn. "He's right," Evelyn said. Ferris nodded as though this was the correct answer and proceeded. When it was done and the small crowd in the yard had done what small crowds do, the brief organized applause, the shift into something looser, people finding each other and finding the food that Pete's wife had organized on long tables against the barn wall, Evelyn stood for a moment at the edge of the platform and looked out at all of it. The people, the ranch, the mountains behind it all going purple in the afternoon light. The aspens trembling in a wind she could barely feel. She thought about a woman collapsing in the snow outside a fence. She thought about soup, about a horseshoe-shaped knocker, and a man who opened the door with a rifle, and then put the rifle down because the threat in front of him had turned out to be something else entirely. She thought about what it cost to survive and what it cost to do more than that. Margaret appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of something and handed one over without comment. They stood together watching Ben try to explain the flower problem to Caswell's wife, who was a patient woman. "Are you happy?" Margaret said. It was not a simple question. Coming from Margaret, it never was. It meant, are you actually happy, or are you performing happiness? And do you know the difference? And have you thought about it honestly? Evelyn thought about it honestly. Yes, she said, not all the way through. There are parts of me that are still… She stopped, still repairing, still figuring out what the shape of things is now. She looked at Nathan across the yard where he was talking to Pete and Garrett and making the specific face he made when someone was telling him something that was going to cost him money. But the foundation is real. That's new for me. She looked at her sister. The foundation being real is new. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I should have written back. Margaret, I know you've forgiven me. I haven't forgiven myself yet. I'm working on it. She drank from her glass. I was afraid of what you'd need and whether I could give it, which was cowardly. It was human, Evelyn said. Sometimes those are the same thing. Yes, Evelyn said. Sometimes they are. Aldridge's trial in Harlan happened in October, 6 weeks after the wedding. Nathan and Evelyn rode in together and gave their statements and sat in the county courtroom while the proceedings did what proceedings do, which is move slowly through the truth toward a conclusion that was not in much doubt. Aldridge was convicted on 4 counts and sentenced to 8 years in the territorial prison at Deer Lodge, which was not everything and was also not nothing. The other men received lesser sentences according to their lesser roles, including the third man who had run, who had turned up voluntarily 2 days after the attack with his hat in his hands, and a story about how he'd been told it was just a property dispute and hadn't understood it would go the way it went, which was probably partially true and didn't matter much either way. Nathan sat through the sentencing without visible expression. In the wagon on the way home, Evelyn said, How do you feel? He drove for a while before he answered. Like it's done, he said finally. Not fixed, but done. There's a difference. She understood that. Done was not the same as healed. Done was just the removal of an ongoing threat, the closing of a particular door. What it left behind was still there. The front room that she still sometimes moved through quickly at night. The specific quality of sound that outdoor footsteps had on the porch that still made her chest tighten before she identified them. These things did not leave on a legal schedule, but done was real. Done was worth something. Good, she said. He reached over without taking his eyes off the road and found her hand and held it, and she let him, and they drove home through the October country with the sky enormous overhead and the mountains wearing their first hard snow of the season. The school came from an accident, the way the best things sometimes do. That winter, their second winter together, the real one, the one without a blizzard at the start, Evelyn had 3 children in her kitchen on a Thursday afternoon besides Ben and Lucas. The oldest was Pete's daughter, Clara, who was 8 and had been missing weeks of the Harlan school because of road conditions. The other 2 were brothers from a homestead family 4 miles east, the Reese boys, 7 and 9, whose mother had appeared at the door in December with a desperation in her face that Evelyn recognized from the inside. I heard you were a teacher, the woman said. Her name was Helen Reese, and she was thin in the way of women who feed everyone else first and then see what's left. I heard you taught those Crow boys. I do, Evelyn said. My boys can't get to Harlan when the roads are bad. The elder's missing 2 months of school most years. She stopped. Her jaw was tight. I can't pay much. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. Then she said, Come in and have coffee, and let's talk about it. By February, she had 7 children in the ranch house on weekdays, pushed the lesson table into the front room to accommodate them, and had written to the county education office in the county seat about the possibility of a formal district school for the homestead families in the Eastern Range. The reply came back in March, cautious, interested, full of the particular bureaucratic language that meant we are not saying no, but we are not saying yes either. And Evelyn wrote back in April with numbers. Enrollment figures, distances, road conditions, the hours of school that homestead children were currently losing per year due to geography. She wrote it the way she had written the flower problem, the way she approached anything that could be quantified. Here is the variable. Here is the data. Here is what the data says. Nathan read the letter before she sent it. He sat at the kitchen table with it for a long time. You're going to get this, he said. Maybe. You laid it out so they can't say no without looking like they're against children learning arithmetic. He set the letter down. You're going to get this. She did get it. Not easily, not on the first try, not without 3 more letters and a trip to the county seat in May, where she sat across a desk from a man who had clearly not expected her and made her case for 40 minutes while he took notes with an expression that moved from skepticism to something more interested. But she got it. A formal district school to be housed initially in a dedicated room to be built onto the north side of the Crow Ranch house. The county would supply the materials, the Crow Ranch would supply the labor and the land, and Evelyn Crow would be the appointed teacher at a proper salary paid by the district. Nathan and Pete and Garrett built the schoolroom that summer. It took 6 weeks and was not perfect. The east wall let in a draft that they addressed with additional chinking but never entirely solved. And when it was done, it had 8 desks, a proper chalkboard that Nathan had arranged to have freighted from Billings, and a shelf along the south wall that Evelyn filled with every book she could justify purchasing and several she could not. On the first day of school in September, exactly 1 year after their real wedding, which Evelyn noticed and did not mention, and then mentioned anyway because she had become less careful about saying true things, she stood in front of 11 children ranging from 6 to 12 and looked at them. Ben was in the second row, trying to look like he wasn't the teacher's stepson and failing entirely, because he had the same quality of undisguised enthusiasm that made him bad at pretending. Lucas was in the back, which was correct for a 12-year-old, and he had brought a notebook that he'd already filled 3 pages of before she'd said a word, which was not correct for anyone, but was completely correct for Lucas. The 9 other children looked at her with the particular combination of hope and wariness that children bring to new teachers. The hope that this one might be good, the wariness that they've hoped that before. She thought about the schoolroom on Clement Street in Mill Haven, about Harold Baines's hand on the doorframe, about the 2 seconds of her life when she had stood in a blizzard holding a fence post and understood she might die there. "My name is Mrs. Crow," she said, "and this is going to be a good year." It was not a perfect year. It was interrupted by illness in December that took 3 children out for 2 weeks and made Ben spectacularly miserable for 10 days, which made Nathan and Evelyn both spectacularly tired, which led to the first real argument they had as an actual couple, about whether Ben was well enough to return to lessons, Evelyn saying yes with conditions, Nathan saying not yet, neither of them entirely wrong, both of them exhausted enough that the argument became briefly about other things before they caught it and brought it back. They apologized in the kitchen at midnight over cold coffee, which was not a romantic setting but was an honest one, and Nathan said, I don't want to undercut your authority with the school. And Evelyn said, I know, I went too hard on it. And they sat with the imperfection of themselves for a while before going back to bed. This was the thing nobody told you about building something real. It was not a destination. You did not arrive at it and stay. You built it, and then you maintained it, and maintenance was not glamorous, and there were days it felt like more work than the original building. And the question you had to keep answering was whether the thing you were maintaining was worth the maintenance. For Evelyn, the answer was always yes. Even on the bad days, even in the December illness and the argument in the kitchen, and the morning 2 years in when she woke up in the dark and felt the old fear knock at the door again. The fear that it could all be taken, that she was one bad decision away from the blizzard again. She lay in the dark those mornings, and Nathan slept beside her with the deep unconscious reliability of a man who had finally, slowly, learned to sleep again. And she looked at the ceiling of the room that was no longer the small east-facing room, but the main bedroom with its 2 windows. And she thought about all the things she knew now that she hadn't known on the road in the snow. She knew that stability was not a condition you found. It was a thing you made, imperfectly, with imperfect materials. And it held not because it was perfect, but because you kept working on it. She knew that love was not the same as certainty, and that you could love someone deeply and still have mornings where you were afraid, and that the fear did not cancel the love. It just coexisted with it in the way that most real things coexist with their opposites. She knew that children were honest in ways that adults had mostly unlearned, and that the most useful thing you could do for a child was stay, just reliably stay, because presence over time was the thing that rebuilt what loss had taken. She knew that she had walked into a blizzard with 22 cents and come out the other side of it with a life she had not imagined, and that the life was not a gift, it was not luck, it was not anything that had simply happened to her. It was the accumulated result of choices she had made when there were no good choices, when the only available materials were herself and whatever she could hold on to. Years later, and they came, the years, the way years do when you stop looking for them and start living inside them. Evelyn would sit on the porch in the long summer evenings and try to find the exact moment it had changed. The moment the ranch became home instead of shelter. The moment Nathan became husband instead of arrangement. The moment she had stopped testing the ground and started just walking on it. She could never find it. It was not a moment. It was a season, a process, a slow accretion of ordinary days that had somehow, without her noticing the exact instant, become her life. Lucas grew into the land the way he'd said he wanted to, methodically, seriously, with a depth of attention that made the ranch productive in ways it hadn't been before. He married at 24, a woman from the Harlan Valley named Ruth, who had opinions about everything and expressed them without hesitation, which Evelyn privately thought was exactly right for him. He took over the east pastures and ran them with the same care for detail he'd brought to every problem since he was 10 years old arguing about bread density at a kitchen table. Ben raised horses. He changed his mind about the breed 5 times over 12 years before settling on the ones that suited the terrain, which anyone who knew him found entirely predictable. He was never entirely organized and always entirely present, and the horses he raised were known through the county for their temperament, which made sense given who had trained them. He married twice, the first time too young and briefly and unhappily, the second time at 30 to a widower with 2 daughters who described Ben on the occasion of their wedding as the most exhausting person she had ever met, and the only one she'd ever wanted to stay with, which was, Evelyn thought, exactly the right way to put it. Nathan's bad knee got worse as the years did what years do to bad knees, and there was a period in his late 50s when the mornings were difficult, and he would not say so, and Evelyn would watch him not say so, and find it equally infuriating and heartbreaking, which was the specific mixture of feelings she had come to associate with loving someone who was stubborn in the precise ways she was also stubborn. She bullied him into seeing a doctor in Harlan. The doctor confirmed what she'd suspected and prescribed what she'd suggested, and Nathan came out of the appointment and said, "You could have just told me." And she said, "I did tell you." And he said, "You could have told me louder." And she said, "Nathan, I have been telling you for 3 years." And he said, "I heard you the first time. I just needed to hear it from someone who went to medical school." And she looked at him for a long moment and then laughed, because there was nothing else to do with a man like that. And he smiled in the slow way he had that still, after all the years, did something to the air in whatever room it happened in. The school expanded twice, first into a second room, then into a proper building that the county funded in full. A real schoolhouse on a parcel of donated land, the Crow land, half a mile up the Miller Road where the road was flat and accessible from 3 directions. Evelyn taught in it for 22 years. She sent students to Harlan for secondary education, to Billings for further study, to places she had never been, and some she had. 2 of them became teachers themselves, which she found was the thing she was most proud of, the particular pride of a lineage, not of blood, but of something she had given that had been passed on. On the last day of school before she retired, she stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse and looked at the room. The 8 desks had become 22. The chalkboard was the same one Nathan had freighted from Billings, replaced once after it cracked, but the same. The shelf along the south wall held 112 books. She knew because she had counted them the week before, and each one had been there for a reason. She stood in the doorway, and she thought about a woman who had knocked on a door in a blizzard and been let in. She thought, everything after that was a choice. The courage to stay, the courage to ask for what she needed, the courage to love something after she'd learned that love did not guarantee anything. None of it had been given to her. None of it had been taken from her without her permission for very long. She had built a life out of what was left when everything else was gone. And what was left, it turned out, had been enough. Not because she was exceptional, but because she had refused to be finished, because she had knocked on the door. Nathan was waiting for her in the wagon at the road. He was older than he looked from a distance. When you knew him, when you could see the years in the way he held the reins and the way he turned when he heard her coming. But he was still the man who had opened a door in a blizzard and put the rifle down. He was still the man who had sat across a barn floor and offered her a choice when she had no choices left. She climbed up beside him. He reached over and straightened her coat collar without being asked, the way he'd been doing for years, and she let him, the way she'd been letting him for years. "Done?" he said. She looked back at the schoolhouse once, at the windows and the door and the 22 years behind it. Done, she said. He clucked at the horses and they moved off down the Miller Road, and the school disappeared behind the hill, and ahead of them the ranch sat in the afternoon light, the way it always had, the way it would after them, solid and specific and theirs. She had come here with 22 cents and a thin coat and the stubbornness to keep moving when everything said stop. She was leaving with considerably more, not just the ranch and the years, and the family built piece by careful piece from broken materials. She was leaving with the knowledge that the worst winter of your life can be the first morning of something else entirely, if you knock on the door, if you hold on, if you refuse, even when you are down to nothing, to mistake not yet for never. The mountains stood where they always stood. The aspens were just beginning to turn. She was home,